Episode 20. The Vindication of the Just One. The Gospels that we have just been exploring present us with accounts of Jesus' life and work that speak to the experience of his followers living long after the event. They provide a narrative rich in theological interpretations developed over the 40 to 60 years since the events to which they refer. They are the explanatory accounts which were accepted most widely in the mainstream Christian communities in the early centuries of Christianity. They are quoted by defenders of Christianity like Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century. He and his contemporaries refer to gospel text as authoritative. In later generations, they will provide a basis from which to build more philosophical theological arguments against competing versions of who Jesus was and what he meant. As you know, our 4 Gospels were not the only Gospels that were created, preserved, and read by ancient Christian communities. We've already explored the ways that backstories about Mary from other Gospels have had an impact on devotional beliefs and art. And we've noticed that elements of alternative Gospels are reflected in the text of the Quran. But the 4 Gospels were the most widely accepted. They were validated over the centuries by the many local Christian communities. Those communities recognized in them an authentic account of who Jesus was and what his life, death, and resurrection meant for his followers. We can see their importance displayed physically in the Codex Sinaiticus, the book from the monastery on Sinai, which is on display in the British Library. It dates from late in the 4th century. That was the century when Christianity was first decriminalized and then actively promoted under the Emperor Constantine and most of his successors. Codex means book in our modern sense, with many pages bound together rather than a continuous scroll. The book with pages was a distinctively Christian way of presenting sacred text. If you think about the way Christian narratives constantly refer to Tanakh text, you can see why the form appealed. If you want to cross-reference the narratives of the life and work of Jesus with the texts of the Jewish Bible, it's much easier to do it with a book than with a scroll. Sinaiticus, the oldest of the Christian books in the British Library, includes the Greek version of the Jewish Bible, the letters of Paul, and the other familiar letters, the Acts of the Apostles, and our 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is a physical token of how much the 4 Gospels were valued in comparison with their rivals by the time of imperial Christianity. But we have also seen how the individual Gospels preserve layers of interpretation, and how each of the 4 authors highlights different aspects and understandings of Jesus and his mission. The apparent discrepancies between the Gospels will prompt a 2nd century Syrian Christian to produce a harmonized version of the life of Jesus, ironing out the wrinkles, the first of many such efforts over the years. But the fact that there are differences among the Gospels is helpful to us. When we put them side by side with the writings of Paul, the letter of James, the letter to the Hebrews, and the letters of Peter and John, we begin to understand that making sense of what happened through Jesus was very much a work in progress for 1st century Christians. Let's step back again and remind ourselves of what things might have looked and felt like in the 40s and 50s of the 1st century. And let's consider some of the background narratives and ideas that would have been around to help Christians make sense of what had just happened. This will help us begin to understand why there are multiple answers to the 2 key questions: who is Jesus and how does he save us? Paul's letters will offer some of the most detailed early answers to those questions. But Paul is trying to respond to the challenges and questions of his non-Jewish communities, while still representing a version of the Christian message acceptable to Jewish Christians. So, if we want to see what the earliest purely Jewish layers of explanation look like, we need to look at some of the other texts. Let's start with the letter of James. We don't know when it was written, but it claims to be from James, the servant of the Lord, and is addressed to the Jewish Christian communities outside Judea. It is unlikely to have been written by the James of the Gospels, nor by the James mentioned by Paul as the brother of the Lord, who presided over the Christian community in Jerusalem. However, names are important. In the tense debate over whether non-Jewish Christians had to follow the Torah, Paul took one side of the debate very firmly. It is faith in Jesus Christ that counts for salvation, not male circumcision or keeping the food laws. But when Paul is trying to justify both his position and his ministry, he has to invoke the names of James and Peter as the two pillars of the church. Even though he does this with a certain amount of sarcasm, he still needs to persuade his readers that the two pillars have accepted his message and his ministry, because James and Simon Peter are two names that his readers trust. They are the authoritative Jewish founder members of the Christian movement. So the letter of James is written for Greek-speaking Jewish Christians, and the name of the author is a name that Jewish Christians can trust. What then is the author interested in? And what can it tell us about early Jewish Christian perspectives on the meaning of Jesus, his preaching, his death and resurrection? The first thing that is striking about this text is how much of it reads as variations on themes from the Sermon on the Mount. The focus is on the life of a community in obedience to Jesus' new interpretation of the law, described as a law of freedom. We recognize phrases like ask and you shall receive, judge not and you will not be judged, or the praise of poverty and the condemnation of wealth from Luke's version of the Beatitudes. A second feature is the insistence on action. We might recognize this from Matthew's Gospel as well. James is firmly rebutting an extreme interpretation of Paul's claim that we are saved by faith in Jesus, not by the works of the Torah. In context, Paul was arguing that a male Christian does not have to be circumcised to be saved. However, some of his readers clearly thought he meant that if you had faith in Christ, then you could just sit back in church and wait calmly for the end of the world. James is having none of it. Show me your faith without action, and I will show you my faith from my actions. You believe that God is one? Well done. The demons do as much and tremble for it. You need to realize, you hollow human being, that faith without action achieves nothing. To rub the point home, James takes exactly the same passage that Paul cites in his argument that only faith matters, but gives it almost the opposite interpretation. Paul had taken a passage from Genesis. Abraham believed, and therefore he was counted righteous. James points out that Abraham was prepared to offer up his son Isaac in obedience to God, and argues that Abraham's faith worked alongside his actions. His faith was completed in action. Not faith not works, but faith and action. James is very specific about the sort of actions that he means. Members of a community are to look out for the poor among them. Faith that fails to do that is a lifeless corpse. In fairness to Paul does actually draw attention to this key bit of Christian behaviour in his letter to the Corinthians. Paul and James are not actually on completely different pages. But James is writing a stern corrective to what is clearly a widespread misreading of Paul's message. Besides this emphasis on action and some specific instructions about behaviour, James also has strong words about what lies behind failed prayer and bad choices. There is an inner struggle between evil worldly desires and the life according to wisdom. The desires must be conquered by resisting the devil, purifying oneself and drawing close to God. In an echo of Luke's Beatitudes, the Christians should abase themselves, mourn and weep. Humble yourself before the Lord, and he will raise you up. There are elements of this human anthropology and pathway to salvation that are similar to the spirituality of the groups represented in the Jewish Qumran texts. The emphasis is on struggle, humility, and turning from the world. Salvation is in the gift of God. This too overlaps with Paul's message, but in a different register. God stands fast against the arrogant, but gives favour to the lowly. The praise of humility is complemented by a diatribe against the rich. We can recognise the first of Jesus' woe sayings in Luke's Gospel. Woe to you rich. In James, the language is violent and revolutionary. Come now, you wealthy, weep and wail for the misery that is about to come upon you. But the problem is not simply being rich. It is also the culpable injustice that has produced their wealth. We hear echoes of Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah denouncing the wealthy establishment. You withheld the wages of the workers harvesting your fields. Now they shout out. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. But James mentions one last injustice, which gives an insight into how he is reading the death of Jesus. What does the death of the just man mean against the background expectations of the perfect covenant community? You were comforting your hearts on the day of slaughter. You condemned, you murdered the just one. He does not resist you. We recognize a narrative that links Isaiah 53, that fourth servant song, and the Book of Wisdom. The wealthy and powerful evildoers, given over to the world and betraying their heritage, put the righteous man to the test and kill him. It is the narrative of Socrates translated to a Jewish context. It is echoed in contemporary narratives of Qumran that sets the wealthy aristocracy of Jerusalem against the members of the covenant of the true Israel, the sons of light against the sons of darkness, the followers of truth against the followers of the lie. It overlaps with a narrative that rereads the stories and legends of the prophets as stories of persecution by unjust authority. In words of Jesus reported in Matthew and Luke, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, slain between the altar and the sanctuary. The just one, unjustly slain, is a title of Jesus. We hear it used by Luke in Acts of the Apostles. Stephen, in a speech that will lead to his martyrdom, denounces his audience with these words: "You killed all those who foretold the coming of the just one." So maybe we can see here a powerful early narrative that explains what is happening as Jesus is judged and slain. The rich and powerful do what they have always done and attack the righteous. But God vindicates his servant, the just one, and raises him up. We've seen that language in the fourth servant song of Isaiah, as well as the Book of Wisdom. My servant shall be lifted up, exalted. The souls of the righteous are in the hands of God. And we see this in the early sermons of Acts, as reconstructed by Luke. The points to hold on to are that this way of making sense of events is rooted in the contemporary Jewish context. But it is not yet concerned about what crucifixion itself achieves. Luke claims to have done some homework, and he does seem to be making an effort to reconstruct early Christian preaching in Acts. So let's pay attention to the speech he puts in the mouth of Peter at Pentecost. Peter is speaking to an audience who knows their scriptures. So each step of his argument is developed with quotations from the Psalms. I've left those bits out. These then are the points that the speech emphasizes. This Jesus you killed by nailing him to the cross, but God raised him up from the pangs of death. God raised up this Jesus, and we are witnesses to this. Raised up to the right hand of God, he has received the promise of the Spirit from the Father, and poured it out as you see and hear. So let the whole house of Israel know for sure that God has made Lord and Messiah this Jesus whom you crucified. The cross is there, but the focus is on God vindicating Jesus according to his plan, and validating him as the figure prophesied in Daniel, the Messiah who will rule and judge at the end of time. Let's go back to the letter of James. Immediately after mentioning the Just One, James reminds his readers that they are waiting for the end of time. He calls on them to practice patience until the Lord appears. As ever, Lord hovers ambiguously between a messianic title and a divine title. The judge stands at the gates, James warns them, and they are to imitate the endurance of the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As a final consolation, he echoes words of Exodus and Deuteronomy. The Lord is merciful and full of forgiveness. It is a way of telling the story of salvation in which there are three essential steps. The first is Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom, in which he gives a charter for a new, faithful covenant community. The second is his unjust rejection and execution at the hands of the worldly authorities who reject the kingdom. The third is his vindication and exaltation as the Just One, the Messiah and Judge at the end of time. Those who are baptized in his name participate in the new community, abiding by its law of freedom and doing good works until the judgment at the end of time. Key to this new way of life is acceptance of the heavenly wisdom and resistance to the lure of worldly powers and interests. In the first and second Christian centuries, alternative stories of salvation emerged, which had their roots in this sort of vindication narrative. Salvation through wisdom and obedience. Some of these maintain an ambiguity about the divine status of Jesus. In some versions, he isn't even crucified. He is rescued from the cross beforehand. That version is echoed in the Quran. In other narratives, Jesus' divine status is indeed affirmed. However, not only does he not die on the cross, but he is not really a physical human being of flesh and blood at all. He is a spiritual being sent into the world to rescue the chosen spiritual people. We see John's Gospel and the letters of John firmly resisting such accounts and asserting that Jesus comes in the flesh and not just in the spirit. The Christian bishop Irenaeus lived in the 2nd century and criticizes a whole array of such alternative salvation narratives. He takes particular aim at Gnostics, people who believe in salvation by secret knowledge. Based in the intellectual and spiritual melting pot of Alexandria in Egypt, they blended Christian and Jewish text with speculation in a Platonic style to create a cosmic story of salvation. Those gifted with secret saving knowledge from Jesus are rescued from a failed world in order to be reunited with the supremely good source of all reality. One of the parallel Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, shows hints of this Gnostic Christianity, salvation by wisdom, at an early stage. Irenaeus also criticizes another variant of the cosmic story that pays more attention to the details of Christian and Jewish texts. A Christian teacher called Marcion had disturbed the communities in Rome by suggesting that the Old and the New Testament presented such different pictures of God that they must each refer to two different gods. The Old Testament presented a vengeful and punitive creator of a world governed by the law. The New Testament, especially in the writings of Paul and Luke, presented the loving Father of Jesus Christ. Paul also spoke of freedom from the law of the flesh. We'll see later on what he might actually have meant there, but Marcion took this to mean being rescued from that fleshly law. the fleshly law of a universe created and ruled by the vengeful God. Those who have faith in Jesus are saved by their faith for the transcendent kingdom of the loving and merciful Father. These different developments of a basic salvation narrative remind us how open sacred texts are to new readings. Both accounts can claim to be rooted in the same New Testament writings. The Gnostics deploy allegorical reading to find their exotic cosmological narratives hidden in the Bible texts. Remember how the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived at the same time as Paul in the mid-1st century, modelled this way of reading Scripture. He analyses the text of Genesis and Exodus and finds in them symbolic expressions of Platonic and Stoic philosophy, as well as a literal description of things that happened. The Gnostics, however, take allegorical reading to an extreme and lose any interest in the literal meanings on the way. Marcion is doing the opposite. His argument is based on a very literal reading of God's behaviour in each of the two Testaments. They seem so different that the Creator God of the Torah cannot possibly be the same person as the loving Father proclaimed by Jesus Christ. Irenaeus maintains a middle space between the two extremes. He counters the wild, allegorical reading of the Gnostics with careful reading of the mainstream scriptures and the authority of tradition. When countering Marcion, he insists on the fundamental continuity between the Jewish and Christian scriptures and the need for some allegorical interpretation of the Tanakh language of God. Irenaeus represents mainstream Christianity. He is reining back speculative philosophical theology when it gallops off in different directions and moves too far from the familiar language of tradition. That tradition says that the same Creator God leads humanity through a real earthly history and prepares them finally to receive salvation through his Son Jesus Christ, who truly came in the flesh. And of course, in spite of those later deviations from the mainstream, salvation through wisdom and through faith in Jesus does remain an important theme in the Gospels. So too does the theme of the just man unjustly condemned and vindicated by God. But they do not provide the only layers of meaning. It is the narrative of the cross which gives a dramatic focus to all the Gospels, and which has commanded the attention of Christian theologians throughout the centuries. So what did Jesus' death on the cross do? We'll start looking at that in the next episode.